In this video, you will learn how to convert between fractions, decimals, and percents. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to convert a decimal to a percent. When we have to convert a decimal to percent, you would multiply by 100. In other terms, you're really moving the decimal place to the right 2 times. For instance, 0.568 or 568 thousandths times by 100 equals 56.8%. So it's fine to have a decimal like we had right here in your percent. Now, remember we just moved it 2 times to the right. Second example, 0.87 tenths times by 100 equals 87%. So here we got rid of all the decimals. Right, 1, 2 to the right. Now let's do 13.4 times by 100. And we're gonna get 1,340%. I know you usually have percent of 100, but it's fine to have it more than 100, right? So right now I got 1,000. We got 1,340. Let's do one more. So this one's a very weird looking one, but we're going to times by 100 like we've been doing. And we're going to get 0.08%. So it's also fine to have not even a whole number, this one. So now let's do the opposite. Let's do percent to decimals. So before we were doing decimals to percents, now we'll do percent decimal. So before we multiplied by 100, now we're gonna divide by 100. In other terms, we're moving the decimal place to, so when you think of a decimal place, so for instance, if we have 8%, technically that decimal place, if there is a whole number, is right, it should be right like here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna divide by 100, and we're really moving the decimal place to the left 2 times. And that gives us 1 0, and then so that's 0.08. You could add a 0 if you want in front of it. So we're moving the decimal place to the left 2 times. If you don't have a decimal, it's totally fine. All you really have to do is put that decimal right after a number. So number 2, if we have 5% this time, the same thing. We're moving it 2 times to the left. 1, 2. That makes 1 0 over here. That's 0.05. You can have the 0 in front of it if you want. Let's do 2 more examples, and then we'll move on to the other example. 689% divided by 100 equals, right over here technically is decimal place 1, 2, right over here. So that's 6.89. Let's do one more and then we'll move on. 23% divided by 100 gives me right here 1, 2. So that's 0.23. You could add the 0 if you want in front of it. Now let's move on to percents to fractions. So here, there's some steps you have to follow. Your first step should be to write the percent as a fraction of the denominator of 100. So your first step is, again, write the percent as a fraction with a denominator of, this will make more sense when we do some examples. And 2 is simplify if possible. You should always simplify your fraction if they're, right, if it could be, so this is like, it won't always could be simplified, but if it can, you should always simplify it. Some examples. If I have 56%, what I'm going to first do is make it over 100. 56 over 100. I'm going to put that 100 underneath it, right? So this, and then if I can simplify it any further, that'll be, right, I can simplify it, and I get 114 over 25. I can divide both by 4, right? You don't have to write that right there, but that's it. So again, you have to add that denominator, and that's it. That's really much your, all you got to do is put 100 below it, right? That's it, and then you're done. And you have to always check, like, okay, can I simplify it any further? If you can, you should always, always, always simplify. So number 2, 35% equals, so this is going to be 35 over 100. I know right away I can simplify for sure because, right, they're both, this one's 5, so this is 0, so it's both could be divided by 5. That's going to give me 7 over 20. And I write the right away there, I can't really simplify any further. Right, so I divide it again by that 100. Number 3. Let's do 215%. So this one's right away, so it's the same thing, your first step. When you're simplifying it, you could actually, just since you know, right, they're 2 full 200s, right? You get 2 and 15 over 100. Now you can't really stop because you can actually simplify even further to 2 and 320. So that's your final answer over here. 2 and 320. Again, when the percent is over 100, you know your number should be mixed. You should have a whole number and then a fraction because this one's over 100. Now let's do the last one. That's going to be 9% equals, again, same thing, 9 over 100. I can't simplify it any further. These ones are pretty simple and straightforward. All you really have to remember is to simplify. Now, let's do the opposite. We're going to do fraction to a percent. So these ones are important. And so the first step you should be write an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100. Again, that 100 is really the number we're focusing on. So some examples. So your first example will be 2/5. This is a fraction, right? Take for instance, I'm going to make an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100. How I'm going to do that is I'm going to first put my denominator because I know it has to be 100. Now we have to figure out what number can I times 5 by to get 100. In other terms, 100 divided by 5. That is times 20. So whatever I do to the denominator, I must do to the numerator as well. I will also times the numerator by 20, which will be 40. Again, so this time you're actually not going to be simplifying it because you do not want to get rid of that 100 as your denominator. And that will just be 40%. So this time you don't have to simplify it. When you're converting a fraction into a percent, do not convert into, do not simplify, right? You want your number to have 100 as the denominator. One more, let's do 2 more examples. So next one will be 4/5. 4/5. Again, we know 5 could go into 100. And that's going to be times by 20. And again, same thing to the numerator. That's 80. And that gives me 80%. I want to do one more. Let's do on the top over here. 8/25. And right away I know I can write my denominator, which will be 100. Now I have to figure out what number times a 25 is going to give me 100. In other words, you could think about it as 100 divided by 25. And I know that's 4, so I'm going to really times 25 by 4. Must do to the numerator as well. And that gives me 32. And this just equals 32%. So here is an extra step. You have to really think about finding the numerator because right away you know your denominator has to be 100 in order to convert it into percent because percents are out of 100. Now, let's do fractions to decimals. So when we're doing this, we need to, first let me give you an example. So your first example is changing 9/25 into a decimal. If you remember, we're actually going to be using the long division to help us. So what our first step is going to be is you have to make it again into a decimal. There's actually 2 ways you can be doing this. Your first method is very simple, and this is to make their denominator into 100, right? Same thing. Whatever number I go times here, so I times this by 4, so I have to do the same thing to the top, times by 4, and I get 36. However, this, then you just plug it in as 0.36. However, you have to figure out, this would not always work, but that's why I prefer to just get used to the long division method because long division will always work. Sometimes you're converting right times and make it into 100 will not work. So again, let me show you how this would bend with long division. So I would plug the first number, which is your numerator, inside, right? And then outside, I would plug in 25, the denominator. So right now, this is the divisor. Now I'm just going to do the same thing. How many times can 25 go into 9? 0 times. That means I must put a decimal in here, bring it up. And then how many times can 25 go into 90 now? Well, 3 times. This will be 75 minus, I get 15. And I plug that 0 in again. You can go in 6 times. 150. I'm going to do this very briefly. That's here. So your final answer should be 0.36. Again, you got the same answer. So that's why I prefer to do over long division because it will always work. So right now we're actually lucky we were able to get right at times it by 4 and we were able to get 100. It was very simple, but what I was talking about earlier won't always work. So our next example is 1/3. I can't times this number any whole number to get 100. So I must use that long division. And I'm gonna go this very briefly again, because we already talked about it in the previous video. So this is 9. So here, again, there's a problem that you run into, and that's it will be repeating decimal, meaning I keep on adding those zeros. It's not really gonna do anything. Right? It's gonna keep on giving me a 1, remainder of 1. So I can't really write R1 because I already made it into a decimal, right? I talked about this in the previous video. So what you're gonna do is put that line over the 3. Remember in a video we already talked about, right, when we had to the decimals, right, dividing decimals by whole numbers. They just put that line, and that would indicate, okay, that 3 keeps on going on and on and on forever and ever. So, see, and we couldn't really do that times anything to get 100. So this is what your decimal is, really, a fraction, right? Now, let's do one more example, and we'll move on. Now let's do 2/9. So right away, I can't make it into 100, any whole number. I can't do that. So I must use a long division. I put the 2 inside and the 9 out. And the same thing goes. Points, this is a very big decimal point. 0, and I have 20. Okay, it goes in 2. Again, I'm going over this very briefly and very quickly because if you're having trouble or you haven't seen the other video, you can go over and watch it, dividing decimals by whole number, because that's going to really help. Because again, if you have a 0, since this is already a decimal, I can plug in as many zeros and I don't have to worry about the top, because once you have the decimal, you can put as many zeros. That wouldn't really affect the number, because we already put that decimal place on top, so we don't have to worry about like putting a 0, adding it bottom. Since the 2's keep on going over, this is a remainder. If you're having difficulties, you should probably check out the video. That will really help in this case. So right away, this is our final answer. So now let's move on, and let's do the opposite. Let's do decimals to fractions. If I have the decimal 0.6, my first step will be writing it, write your decimal, which in this case is 0.6, as a fraction in simplest form. Very important to simplify it as much as you can. So what that will look like for us would be 0.6, right, as a fraction. It's very, because this is in the tens place. Right away, your decimals are also in hundreds, but this is in the tens place. That means it's a 60, right? Right, it should be 60 because this is in 100. You can think of a 0 there. And this really gives me 6/10. It's still not simplified because I can actually go even into 3/5. Or you could also think about it just start off with 6/10 because technically there's not a 0 there. It's in the tenths place. So technically it was also, right? So you can start with however you want. Your second step would be, and that's it really. This is it. So this was your last step, and that's to simplify it as much as possible, right? Simplify to the first. So this is your final answer. You should not really be boxing in this because that's not the simplified version. You should always simplify. So one more example. Let's do this time 0.45. Again, I would change this into, since it is in the hundreds place, it's 45/100. And our last step would be to simplify. That's an O, which is 9/20. This is your final answer. let's do one more example, and then we'll move on. So 2.25, right? This would equal 2 and 25 over 100 technically. If it's, right, this is before the decimal, it's a whole number, so you know it would be a mixed number. Now what I would simplify is, you keep the 2, and 25 over 100 is equal to 1/4. So this is your final answer. Now that's it for this video. Hopefully you've learned and find it helpful, and learn how to convert between fractions, decimals, and percent.